Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a sort of educational video for you, a remake of a video I did way back when, talking about a very, very common question that people new to the hobby have. Is like, well, Nick, I know that some folding knives lock. What are the different kinds of locks they use? What's the best kind of lock out there? What's the strongest lock out there? And so I want to take a little bit of time, because I happen to have a bunch of knives on the table that all have different locking mechanisms, to talk about some of these different approaches, some of their strengths, weaknesses, and, talk a little bit about how to think about this. To start with, though, it's important to remember that not all knives lock. In fact, for a long time, that was sort of the norm, right? So you have these kinds of things out here, like this Victorinox Classic, which has been helpfully branded by a certain YouTube channel, plug, Blade HQ available. Anyways, I digress. Look, a lot of knives out there don't lock, and there are a bunch of different kinds of non-locking knives. One of the most common, and frankly one of the oldest ones, are friction folders, like this little guy right here. This is literally a chunk of wood. There's no lock or anything in there. The only thing that's keeping this knife open in your hand is the fact that your thumb is resting on this little lever right here. So, the friction of holding this guy in place. So that is a friction folder in the classical sense. There's literally nothing out there except this lever that's keeping this guy closed in your hand. Then you can go to some of the newer, there are these detent-based folding knives that are, they are non-locking, certainly. There is nothing, I don't even have to do anything to close the blade here. But because what they actually have in there is a little armature there that basically stops the blade while it's open, and that puts a little ball into a hole in the side of this. It's actually very similar to how the detent ball works on a liner lock knife, but it happens to just be rigged to keep the blade open. So there is a little bit of force that actually prevents this guy from closing. The bigger force on this guy, this is, by the way, the Monterey Bay EWC Everywhere Carry. This is the Hiroaki Oda F. Oh, no, I've forgotten. It starts with an F. It's a custom style knife. But the main thing that's keeping this open is actually your fingers being on this little area here and this little area here with the jimping, such that if it does try to close, it's not freaking going anywhere. Then you can get into your more classical slip joint style knives. If somebody talks about a slip joint, chances are they're talking about something that works a little bit like this, where you have a spring along the back of this guy, a back spring, and then as you pull this knife up, you'll see this spring actually lifts out a little bit, and then usually there's a half stop. It pauses there, and then it goes all the way closed. And so when you are holding this guy, really there's nothing locking this knife closed. I can close the knife just by pressing on the backside there, but in order to close it, you need to lift that spring up a little bit, and that actually provides some resistance there, coupled with your thumb being there, coupled with this unsharpened part. So this is a classical slip joint, so to speak, even though this one's made out of titanium. This is by J.E. Made Knives, but it is a good old-fashioned slip joint. So those are all types of non-locking knives. The knife doesn't lock, but they have their own ways of trying to keep your hand safe despite that fact. Then you go into another very traditional approach. This is a twist lock style knife. Open L is really the most commonly known variety of these. This is they refer to this as the Vero block, but nonetheless, the way that this knife works is that you can open and close it, but if you twist this collar, you can see here it inserts some metal underneath the blade such that you cannot close the knife until you untwist that little piece of metal, and in this case, it actually locks closed as well. If you do this, it is now locked closed, and that's a beautiful thing. So this is one approach to locking a knife. Then we can go into our back locks. Now, a back lock is called a back lock because, well, the back of the spine of the knife basically is holding this locking mechanism. And the way that you unlock the knife is by pressing down on this little button here. And when you press it down on that button, it actually raises up this little part, and that little part falls into a little tiny gap in the top of the blade there. And so you can see here that as I am closing this knife, see, drops into place. And now the knife can't close. The knife, in order for this knife to close, it would either have to like rip out the pivot or something stupid like that, or rip out the back lock. But more likely what would actually have to happen is that this part right back here, I would need to press down here, which raises this metal piece out of that little gap and allows me to actually start closing the blade again. This is sort of a middle of the back lock, as opposed to a tail lock. This is a Buck 110, a very classic pocket knife. This is, by the way, a Spyderco Delica, and that was an Open L number 8. But this is a tail lock. It is the same thing as a back lock. It just happens to be that the access to the lever is at the very tail. But again, see, it's sticking this up right at the top there. And so that is a different variety of a back lock with a different locking mechanism. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it is still a back lock. It is still using a little hole that back lock falls into and maintains the blade in its open state. And actually, these can come in a variety of packages. This is an automatic knife. This is the ProTech Knives Magic for California Legal. But this actually has a hidden release, basically, where in order to unlock this knife, you actually have to lift this part up here. And that lifts the backlock spring out of the hole on the back of the blade there. And then it drops back in. So this is effectively a backlock. It just has a very sneaky little trick to it. ProTech Magic is a very, very neat little knife. And that's what we got there. Then there's the Triad Lock. The Cold Steel Voyager here is a very nice example of a triad lock knife. The difference between a triad lock and a conventional back lock is that there are a couple of things. The big one is that there's this pin right in the middle right here. You can see that pin is right there, and then there's actually a little cutout in the blade as well. So when this guy locks up, the blade is being stopped by that pin, and then this little area here, which, again, this is basically a modified backlock, but this little area drops into position there. And so the blade is being held in position both by the curvature of that pin as well as by the lock bar here. Again, it's a very strong lock, but all backlocks are very strong locks, and so it's an absolutely good-to-go style of lock, and it just includes that extra pin, which they're saying adds a little bit of extra strength. And sure, it makes sense that it would, right? So that's a beautiful thing. Next thing in terms of the locking mechanisms. The Reve integral lock. I don't know why, by the way, no particular order here. It's the order I put things down on the table, so don't interpret anything from that. But the next one is the integral lock, the Reve integral lock. This is a Chris Reve Knives small Shabazz, which Reve integral knives, Chris Reve knives, yeah, there's no coincidence there. In a lot of ways, the Chris Reve and Chris Reve knives are what put the frame lock, so to speak, on the horizon for people. This is the same thing as a frame lock, by the way. I can say I can say frame lock, I can say Reve integral lock. It's all the same thing. But anyways, this is a knife in which the back side of the handle is one chunk of titanium, and then as a part of that chunk of titanium, they've cut out a separate lock bar, which is bent such that when I open the knife all the way, this part falls into place. And so now the blade is prevented from closing because there's this part of the handle that is resting against the bottom of the blade, against a flat spot there. And so when I try and do this, nothing happens. When I try and apply force this way on the blade, nothing happens until I move this piece back out of the way. So you've got a frame lock there. The frame of the knife itself is the locking bar of the knife, and that's kind of a cool little technology. And of course, there are a bunch of these out there, and there are a couple of parts that make, you need a lock bar relief cut. This little area right here thins the lock bar out a little bit so it can bend properly. You can have that on the inside of the knife, as it is on this particular piece, or you can actually have it external to the knife, as it is on this particular piece. This is the Grimsmo Knives Norseman, a relatively well-known flipper-style frame lock with a flipper deployment. But anyways, this has an external lock bar relief cutout, so you can see they've thinned the lock bar on the outside there. And so there you go. And then sometimes you'll even get what's called a lock bar insert. Hold on, my notes just got... I'm not a brilliant man, as many of you figuring out already. You have a lock bar insert on this guy. So right here, if you can take a close little look, there's a little tiny piece of steel that's inserted. This is the Alambic Knives Busker, by the way. You can see here there's a little tiny piece of steel, and that little piece of steel interfaces with the steel at the back of the blade there. You can see it again from this angle, and you can actually see the insert inside there. What this does is it prevents lock stick, and, there are other benefits to it, but it's not a crucial thing. There are lots of knives out there that are frame locks that don't have an insert, but it is definitely something that you will very often see. You also sometimes see one of these little guys right here. There's a little tab underneath there, and actually there's a similar one on the Norseman right here. You can see hiding under there, that is an over-travel stop. What that basically does is it prevents you from pressing all the way out. If you press the lock bar too far out in that direction, in theory it could overbend, and then the knife wouldn't want to lock up again. But that little insert actually stops it from going too far and prevents that mode of damage, basically, which is, well, a beautiful thing. No argument there. There's also another type of thing that is often referred to as a bolster lock, which is actually kind of misleading. There was a type of bolster lock that was originally found in like stiletto-style automatics. That's not what I'm talking about here. This is the Holt Knives Spectre right here. This is a particularly fancy one of them. But nonetheless, you can see here that actually what we have here is a frame lock, because this blue part here is the frame. Underneath there is a lock bar, and that is integral to the frame itself. But there is a bolster over here, in this case a polished Damasteel, that is overlaid on top of the lock bar. So it looks like there's really no lock bar, but it's definitely in there. And effectively, the knife is a frame lock. You can also see, by the way, there is a lock bar insert right in here, along with an over-travel stop that's built into that. This particular knife's got some other fancy to it, but nonetheless, this is what people often call a bolster lock, which is usually bolsters on top of a frame lock. So, yeah, that's definitely, that's a factor, and it's something, actually, oh, no, not that particular piece. Anyway, so that's what people often talk to about that. Moving on, the liner lock is a very, very important kind of knife lock, and it's sort of one of the granddaddies, if you will. This was invented previously, but Michael Walker is sort of a, insofar as modern knife making has deities, he's one of them. He is a very serious knife maker, and he invented a bunch of different lockup mechanisms, a lot of which I'm not going to talk about today because they tend to be not super replicated very often. But anyways, a liner lock has a liner inside. This knife actually has a little steel liner on the inside of this underneath these wood scales. And that liner is bent, much like on the frame lock, such that it will come on over and it will prevent the blade from closing. So right now this blade cannot close because this piece of metal is in the way. But if I move this piece of metal over in this direction, this is, by the way, the TRM Atom. If I move that piece of metal out of the way, then the knife can close very easily. This is a conventional liner lock, and it is an absolutely great locking mechanism. And you'll see it in a lot of places. This is the Ontario Rat number 2. And again, you can see right here that in this case, the liners are actually exposed rather than nested. There is a separate piece of metal here, and a part of that piece of metal is bent such that it engages with the tang of the blade down there. So this is a liner lock. Next up is sort of a variant of the liner lock that is a very different variant. This is the Spyderco compression lock. Well, it's the compression lock, but it's made almost exclusively by Spyderco. And the way that this functions is sort of opposite of a liner lock. In a liner lock, conventionally, the lock bar is on the bottom here, and it engages with the bottom of the blade. In a compression lock, instead, what we have here is, see this little hole right here at the top of the blade? There is a little, basically, cave. And then the lock bar is actually, in effect, a little tiny armature that goes up into that cave. It pops over, and it goes into that cave, and it goes underneath this pin right here. This pin is very, very important. What that basically means is that you have, when you've got this guy open, if you press on the back here, what's going on is that the lock bar is inside that cave, and the very above it is this big old pin right here. And so the lock bar is effectively stuck between the blade itself and then this pin on the top here. So there's kind of a rock and a hard place sort of thing. And in order for the knife to close, what would actually have to happen is that this liner lock, this liner at the top here, would have to be compressed between the blade and that pin there. And that's not how steel works. That hardened steel doesn't tend to do that. And so any force that would compress the compression lock would be, well, pretty catastrophic in a variety of other ways. But the interesting thing about a compression lock is that rather than reaching in from the bottom as you do on a liner lock, with this little area here, this is, by the way, the Spyderco Paramilitary 2, you end up reaching in from the top. There's a little cutout right here, and you can use that, and you press this lock bar off to the side, and that allows the knife to close. And in fact, the nice part about this is that your fingers are completely out of the slicing path throughout the process here. At no point does your finger ever come between the blade and the handle. And so you can just do one of these guys and pop that guy open. It's kind of a cool thing, and it's a nice little lock here. This is something that was invented by Spyderco Knives, and in fact, they still hold the patent, so you're not going to see these coming from other manufacturers. On occasion, you will see small custom makers who have licensed this patent out using compression locks in their work, but they tend to be very, very few in number, and relatively few makers are actually doing that. So there you go. That's the compression lock, and that is very much Spyderco's jam. A lot of their high-end and, frankly, medium-end pieces are either doing the back locks or the compression lock right here. So you can see, this is again the Paramilitary, this is the Spyderco Para 3 Lightweight. Again, another compression lock. Again, you see the little cave there. That's how it works. There you go. Next thing, we have a class of locks that you could refer to as the sliding bar locks. The original of this is the Benchmade Knives Axis lock. Well, I don't know about the original, but the one that was patented for a long time is the the Benchmade Axis lock. This is an example of that. Basically, how this works is that there's this little bar here. This little bar sticks all the way through both sides. And so you can pull this little bar back and forth by just putting your fingers on it and pulling. And when you deploy the knife, this little bar pulls back, and then it rides along the back of the blade until eventually it hits this flat portion at the very top of the blade. See that there? And when it hits that flat portion, it springs forward. And so now at this point, in order for the blade to close, that flat portion of the blade would have to go up through this bar, Basically, the bar is being pressed forward against the top of the blade here is what is locking this knife open. And so in order to close the knife, you have to pull that bar back again and then close the knife. And that's actually a really cool technology. It works very, very well. And it provides a very nice ambidextrous opening and closing option, which is a very nice thing. This originally was Benchmade exclusive for a long time, but recently the relevant legal instruments were expired, and other companies have been able to make it. This is an example of a very similar lock. This is what is referred to as the Able lock from Hogue Knives on the Doug Ritter RSK Mark 1 G2, I believe. But again, it's a very similar construction, a sliding bar lock that goes along the top of the blade there. These kinds of locks, the sliding bar locks, are very, very good, and a lot of people really like them for a bunch of different reasons. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that these guys, unlike a lot of these other knives that have that don't really require much in the way of springs, although, for instance, back locks generally have a spring that's underneath there, tensioning things, these guys require little tiny springs. They require omega springs. These are springs that are shaped like an omega that are attached back here and kind of have a circular shape, and those are the things that are pressing this bar forward against the blade. And if those springs break, then this isn't really locking anymore because, well, it won't have any motivation to slide up onto there and to stay over there. So that is definitely one area where these guys, well, they require something else. There is another version from Benchmade, only used in the Anthem, that has a coil spring around the stake, used on the Anthem, but nonetheless, that is one thing there. Next up is a button lock. Now, this particular pocket knife here, this is a Protex Sprint. This is a particularly fancy one, but nonetheless, a button lock is, this is an automatic knife, but a button lock works by having a button, basically, and that button, when you press it down, disengages. You can see there's a little tiny cutout with the blade there. Hopefully I can show this off. Little tiny cutout in the blade there. And then when the knife fully opens, this button is able to pop the rest of the way out. Here, I'll pull it back out again. Watch the button. There you go, the button pops out. And so right now the button is popped out and it's engaged with that little hole in the blade there. And so if I want to unlock this knife, again, I need to press that button back down. That pulls that, takes that post out of that hole and allows me to shut the knife. Like I said, this particular knife happens to be an automatic knife. So if you press the button, it deploys, but there are non-automatic button locks out there in the world. And in fact, they can be great because they offer a very free swinging action, and they offer a very nice experience, particularly if the button is well positioned and everything like that. So button locks are very, very common, and they're not all automatic, although it is very common for them to be. So then there are a couple of little secondary options out there, secondary lockup mechanisms. I don't actually happen to have one of these, but many button locks will actually have a safety. It'll have a little slider that you can slide back that direction, which is an absolutely beautiful thing. This slides this direction, and suddenly the button lock is literally prevented, and it'd be when it's open, the button lock is prevented from being pressed down there. So there is no way to disengage the lock on the knife. And, you know, that can be something, honestly, do I find that to be super helpful? No. Generally speaking, a good button lock is going to be recessed and whatnot, so you don't have to worry about that. But it's definitely something you can see out and about. Another kind of secondary lock is what's shown off on this little guy right here. This is a CRKT. It's a discontinued knife, the Graham Razel. This is a liner lock, but it actually has this little secondary lock. This is the LAWKS locks system on the top here. And basically what this does is if I press this thing forward, if everything is working to spec, which it might not be, if I press this thing forward, then this little lever inserts itself behind the liner lock, which prevents the knife from unlocking. Again, is that super necessary? No, not particularly, but it's something that you will occasionally see, and that's what's going on. They're just ways of holding other locks closed or open, as the case may be, in a more permanent way. Then you can get into all of the other lockup mechanisms. Now, look, I've been talking about some of the most common ones, and it is very common to see things that are slip joints. It's very common to see back locks. These are everywhere. Frame locks are almost hilariously common right now in the knife industry. I mean, the joke is like another flipper frame lock, really? Because they are every freaking where. Liner locks have been a staple for a long time. Compression locks are found throughout Spyderco's lineup. These kinds of sliding bar locks are very, very well known at Benchmade, and they're going elsewhere elsewhere, and a lot of folks make button locks. But there are some knife locks that just don't see that much widespread use. But they are still cool, and they merit some discussion here. This is an example of one such relatively new lock. This is actually, I would say, yeah, this is probably one of the newer locks on the table here today. This is the deadbolt lock. This is a completely ridiculous freaking knife here, but it has a lock that basically there's a spring here, and this whole piece has a set of, you can actually see the little bars that stick down into the blade itself. And so when I press this out, those bars come up out of the blade and allow the blade to shut. But when this knife deploys, you'll see this little guy drop into place, locking those bars into the blade itself. It's absolutely a thing. This is the deadbolt lock. CRKT is the only people making this at the moment. There might be custom versions out there, but if so, I don't know about them. But either way, this is another locking mechanism that's very different, and it's sort of a button lock, but it's entirely different because the pivot itself serves as the lock button, and that's kind of cool. This is another example of a very weird knife. This is the Scorpion lock. This is the Cold Steel 8015. Yeah, I've given all the names. Cold Steel 8015, and this features a Scorpion lock. The Scorpion lock is this bar right at the top here. And actually, this is a lot like how a back lock works, except it's got a bar right here, and then that just drops down into that little hole in the blade. And so to unlock the knife, you just have to lift up this little section here, and then the knife unlocks. So you can, and again, you can do this one-handed. You just grab here and here, and then press down, and then that pops that out of there. But the thing is, this is actually crazy secure, because not only is it nice and deep in there, but as you're gripping the knife, you are going to be pressing it down further into that little area. And so this is a very, very strong lockup here, and it's a very unique lockup. It's articulated down here. It has sort of a separate lock bar. This whole thing is on a spring. And if you want to watch my disassembly, you'll get a better sense of this, or how any of these other knives work. Anything that I've mentioned here today, by the way, I have a full disassembly of, so you can see exactly how it looks like on the inside there. And so the Scorpion lock is another very interesting little thing. This is the Benchmade Knack lock, the Nakamura lock. In some ways, it's a lot like a compression lock, except it doesn't have that bar up on the top there. So it's sort of, how much is this being pressed up out of there? And then this is probably the newest lock on the table, if not the deadbolt. I don't know exactly what the timing looks like, but this is the stop lock. This is a brand new design from Spyderco, and basically this has this little piece. You can watch the whole disassembly video, but it just has this little piece, and then there's this little hollow, and when you fully deploy the knife, it drops down in there. And that is kind of a cool little thing. The nice part about this, and the reason this is actually kind of cool and exciting, is that the lockup mechanism fits entirely within this little space here. All of this is just G10. It's just handled back here. This is the Spyderco Parada, by the way. So you got a bunch of different exotic sort of locks out there, and there are so many more. There's the Hawk lock. And if you look at them closely, a lot of them have some similarities to existing things. The Triad lock is another one you can often hear mentioned as being, at the end of the day, it's very backlocky. And, the Stan Wilson non-flipper flipper has a backlock, etc. But nonetheless, there are a bunch of really crazy locks out there that I don't have time to go into, but a lot of these are some of the common ones that you're going to see in the market. Now, we now come to the portion of the video where we talk about, well, what do you think about when you're choosing a lock? If you're looking for a new folding knife, what do you need to worry about with a lock? Well, there are a couple of things that do come up. I mean, one of the questions is, do you want a lock? I generally advocate that people get locking knives. If you are legally able to do so, there is not a whole lot of harm in having that extra margin of safety. And right now, knife locks are so unobtrusive that very often it's not a problem. But there are certainly very safe non-locking knives out there, and, people got by with slip joints for many years. So that's something to consider. Another thing to consider is handedness. I am a decidedly right-handed human. I am not MB any damn thing. So this is a very, very important thing for me. I'm sorry, this is not a very important thing for me because most things are made for righties. But there are locks out there that are completely ambidextrous. For instance, the Axis-style lock or the sliding bar locks, they are ambidextrous because there is literally no difference between whether you open it with this thumb and this forefinger or on the other side there. The function is identical between those. The same thing with the back lock. As long as you can switch the clip, these knives, you get the exact same experience as a righty and a lefty because, well, the thing that you're touching is right down there in the middle. So back locks, triad locks, and sliding bar locks are pretty much ambidextrous, which can be nice. You also get one-handed operation can be a concern for some people. On the other side, maybe you just don't want to use two hands. And in that case, many of these locks can be operated one-handed. I mean, you can do a frame lock one-handed very, very easily. easily. There's not really a concern there. And similarly, again, you can do a lot of these things one-handed, but there are some locks that are a little less well-suited to that. And one of the nice things is, some of them make it real smooth. Like the compression lock, all you need to do is put your finger in there. It's so damned easy to come. So, you're going to think about that. And if you're regularly doing things that are one-handed, you're not going to want like a twist lock, which is absolutely a two-handed lock, or even tail locks tend to be a little bit more difficult to do one-handed. You need to kind of support it with the other hand as you're doing that kind of thing. There are tricks. You can usually get through it, but at the end of the day, if you want one-handedness, there are some better locks out there for it. The action, the swing open and closed, is going to vary a lot from lock type to lock type. For instance, a back lock is never going to have a super free swing in action. If you open this guy, you are going to need to use your entire thumb to do that, and to close it, you're probably going to need to, it's not going to be a super free swing in action, as opposed to something like this. And to be fair, this knife is, the Grimsmo Norseman here is sort of an example of a free drop in action. But you can get these incredible, just absolutely top-of-the-line, fall-shutty actions, super smooth, absolutely amazing with frame locks, but you can also get them with liner locks. You can get them, one of the nice things with a sliding bar lock is that when the knife is, when the bar is back, there's nothing touching the blade except the washers. And so you can get these very, very nice free droppy actions that way. I mean, but even like the deadbolt lock has a very similar sort of thing. So if you're looking for a very, smooth fall shut, which some of you may be thinking, come on, you're talking about tools. What are you thinking about smooth fall shut? You freaking, you idiot. You got a point there, buddy. But, that's something a lot of folks think about. And a lot of these do well. But for instance, a back lock might not be your choice if you want super smooth action. Then there are design constraints as you're making a pocket knife. For instance, some of these locks scale down very well. Some of these locks don't. This is the stop lock here is a super compact lock. There's really not that much going on there. And similarly, you can fit frame locks in relatively small knives, but it gets a little bit more difficult to fit some of these other things in there. And then one of the other big things is, do you ever want to have your fingers in the slicing path as you're closing it? One of the big downsides, for instance, to a knife like this, a frame lock, is that as you are closing the knife, you need to put your thumb over to the side here and then start to close the knife. And very often you'll have like a flip a tab or an unsharpened area, so that way you can get your thumb back out of the way and close the knife the rest of the way. But for some people, that feels a little bit creepy. It's not as much a concern with a very slow action. On the Shabazz here, it's not going to drop shut really ever. That's not how this knife is designed to work. But it can be a concern. And so for some people, if that's something that bothers them, something like a sliding bar lock where you're able to just pull it back with your fingers and put the blade shut that way, or a compression lock is going to be very nice in that way, because you don't need to ever have your fingers in the slicing path. Even a button lock would work pretty well there. So there are a lot of different constraints in terms of choosing a folding knife mechanism, and a lot of these things are going to only be found in certain price points, right? Liner locks tend to be the name of the game up until you get, into the $50, $60, $70 range. Again, speaking of early 2020 here, then you can start to find like steel frame locks from time to time. You'll find back locks, etc., slip joints. But, then as you go up higher, you start to find more and more frame locks. You start to find fewer, either way. There's no strong and fast rule, but there are a lot of things that might determine the locking mechanism that you end up using. However, one of the biggest questions, and the last question I want to address, is one of the most common ones, which is, what is the strongest knife lock out there? So I want to give a really unsatisfying answer to that and say that all of them are good enough these days. In practice, any properly designed and functional locking knife is strong enough for pretty much every daily task that you're going to have. As a normal person going throughout your life, any of these locks are going to be just fine. If you take out and aside some of the really old school models or the non-locking versions, they're all pretty much gonna work. Back locks are super strong. Frame locks can be super strong. The triad lock, that's sort of its claim to fame, right? But the thing is, for the longest time, right, slip joints were the norm. That was sort of how things worked. Friction folders were the approach. That was what you had. And the thing is, you also need to remember that any folding knife, no matter its variety, is always going to be safe when applying force in the cutting direction. As you are cutting, you are going to be applying force in this direction, and usually then the blade is being pressed up against the stop pin. It's being pressed up against solid metal. So any knife is fine as long as you're going in the cutting direction. Where it becomes dangerous is if you start applying pressure to this side of the knife, or if you stab into something for some reason and then you start, levering, that could make the blade closed, and then that's when you need a lock there. But the thing is, in practice, most people don't require that folding lock to be super strong in their daily life. And at the end of the day, there are a lot of companies that have specialized in selling the strongest lock ever. Oh my God. And they'll do things like testing and, showing, like hanging weights off the back of it. Thing is, in effect, yeah, sure, it might be a stronger lock than some of the other ones out there on the market. And certainly, I'm not objecting to that. But the thing is, it's like when these people are selling you a watch that dives down to like 10,000 meters or something like that. Like, yeah, okay, that absolutely could be stronger. Yeah, okay, that absolutely could be different. But the thing is, you're not going to need that strength, so it's probably not a major concern. So I really do encourage you to make your decisions based on practical issues like handedness, like design constraints, like the desired action, like all of those other kinds of things we already talked about, rather than fixating on lock strength. It's a useful thing to think about, but any modern knife that is designed competently and put together well is going to lock up securely in a way that's going to work absolutely fine for most of your daily life. But some of you are saying, I hear you saying right now, Nick, hold on, no. You see, I am hardcore. You see, I am regularly doing X, Y, or Z. I am smoke jumping into combat. I don't freaking know. Those aren't the same thing. Anyways, and so I need the strongest knife I can possibly get. Something that is strong beyond anything else. The strongest possible pocket knife. You're doing abusive tasks. You're batoning. You're using the knife as a ladder step. Hammering it into a tree. All of those different things. In that case, there is absolutely one clear choice of locking mechanism that you're going to want to use for that. And that is a fixed blade knife. At the end of the day, if you absolutely need strength above all else, and you need strength in weird ways, you need strength, to be able to spine whack with if banging something, you're banging a tent post into, you want a single continuous chunk of metal. That is the very strongest locking mechanism on any knife ever, is a single continuous chunk of metal. So if you are going to be doing a bunch of abusive tasks, find yourself a fixed blade, like this Bradford Guardian right here. But aside from that, any folding knife should serve you fine in your everyday life. So there you go. I hope you found this interesting and that you learned a little bit something about some of the lockup mechanisms you find out there in folding knives. And mostly, I hope that you have yourselves just an absolutely wonderful rest of your day and that I've got this subject matter here on lockdown. Okay, trying my best not to lie to you. If I do, I was framed. It's okay, I'll be back for another video. Don't get him up in a twist if there's a problem. Yeah, okay. Anyways, that was terrible. Hope this was interesting to you. Have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.